Okay, this is a video tutorial for just about any class that is going to be rendering out animation sequences of one kind or another, and they need to be able to bring those into Premiere, deal with them at the appropriate timeline, frame rate, and things like that. So this isn't for any one particular class. However, if you are in a class that requires that, this will hopefully be a really big help. So this video is assuming that you have already rendered out your animation images and that those images are named appropriately. Let's just open up my image sequence right here. You can see that this frame just happens to start on 4,440, but this really is the very first frame of this animation sequence. Yours hopefully has, .001 as your first image, but you can see that as I scroll down, we just have a big image sequence for this particular animation. Now, I know where those images are, so I can double-click inside of my project asset folder. This is where I can just double-click to bring in these pictures. I have to navigate to find this location, but I'm just going to select the very first frame, and notice right here it says Image Sequence. If this image sequence is not checked on, I am only going to be importing this first frame. I want it to be brought in as a whole sequence, almost like I'm asking Premiere to turn it into a movie before it's even a movie. So I'm going to check Image Sequence and hit Open. Now, depending on the speed of your computer and the location of your files and how big the pictures are and things like that, this might take just a couple of seconds, or it might take, several tens or 15 or 35 seconds, minute and a half, depending on how slow your computer is. But you notice that here it is, and as I just drag across, I'm using Adobe CC, so if you aren't using Adobe CC, you may not have the same functionality that I do, but you'll still be able to follow along. But as I drag through, you can see that this animation is actually playing through. But it doesn't really tell us, unless I hold over here, that my animation is playing, or it assumes that it's playing at 30 frames per second. Now what I can do is I can come down to the bottom and I can switch it from the icon view to the list view. And if it's inside of the list view, I can see right there it says 29.97 frames per second. Now, is that really the frame rate that I want my animation? Well, this all depends. Unless you've changed something inside of Maya, you're actually running at 24 frames per second. Now, all I need to do is right-click on my asset, go over to Modify, and say Interpret Footage. Now, when I open that up, you're going to see that it says Frame Rate, the very first option. And we see Use the frame rate from the file. But that's not really true, because this is an image sequence. This isn't a video file. So the computer is just assuming that we want it to run at this 29.97. What we can do instead, though, is if I just click down here and it says Assume this frame rate instead. So I'm going to highlight it and just type in 24 frames per second. And that's pretty much it. So as soon as I hit OK, you'll see down here that it now says 24 frames per second. Now, if there's already a timeline inside of here, I'll just right-click and make one. So I'll say I want a new sequence. And it says, okay, well, what do you want? Now, I know that my animation is 24 frames per second. So I'm going to make sure that I'm choosing 24 frames per second. If I don't do that, there's no guarantee that this is going to be accurate. And then, of course, I can give it a name, a very useful name, maybe something like Cooley Animation 01. That way, my name is on it, and I know what it is. So I'll hit OK. And here we have our timeline. Now, this is the interesting thing. I'm going to select this animation, and I'm going to drag it into my timeline, and I'm going to let go. Now, the animation sequence, don't misunderstand me. When we're working inside of 3D animation, we think of animation sequences as those big, long picture sequences that are numbered in order. But that's not what Premiere thinks of as a sequence. Remember, Premiere is primarily used for editing film and commercials and videos. So when it says sequence, it's actually talking about a sequence of events. So it's actually calling this timeline a sequence. Okay? Now, I'm going to call this my animation, and I'm going to call this my timeline. Okay? Because that's really what this is. This is a timeline. It has time, and we put the video on it. Now, it says that the animation that I have running at 24 frames per second is not the same as this timeline. And what would I like to do? Well, if I know that my animation has been set properly, I can say change the sequence settings. Watch what happens over here when I do that. Notice that now my timeline is now exactly 24 frames per second, and the resolution is exactly the same as this piece of animation. This is now correct. Okay? Now, you might bring your animation in, and it may seem as though it's a very, very small bit, and you have all this extra space to work in. Well, that's simply because you're not looking at it exactly the way that we would normally think of. And all I need to do to get closer to it, to look at it zoomed in, is to hit plus, 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 plus. Now I can drag my timeline and I can see my animation. Now keep this in mind. Depending on the speed of your computer and depending on a lot of other factors, this may not be able to play in what's known as real time. In other words, if I just hit my space bar or I hit the play button, there is no real guarantee that your computer would be able to play this completely. See how even this is starting to stutter a little bit? Chances are it's because I'm in the middle of recording this, and so my computer's kind of doing double time work. But just be aware that it's not necessarily impossible to see this work. If it's not playing in real time, you will be able to see it in real time once you make your movie. But don't think that there's a problem with your animation if it just seems to be stuttering instead of playing very smoothly. Also, I want to point this out. Right now I'm looking at all of the different pictures, which is fine. But if I come over here and I look at details, you notice how each one of these pictures is roughly the same size. I mean, you know, off by 1 kilobyte or so, but that's not a big deal. Well, if any of your animation frames are very, very different, in other words, as we're coming down here, if one of these is suddenly 1 kilobyte, what that actually means is that your frame, this particular frame, is actually incomplete. Now, there's a lot of different reasons that that could happen. One of them is simply because Maya, when you're rendering, sometimes it glitches because it's rendering across a network, or it just got tired, or you're trying to render it on a thumb drive. There's a lot of different reasons that things could just go wrong. From inside of here, even if you hit play, you wouldn't actually see that bad frame. Premiere would simply jump past it to continue playing. But once you tried to make your movie, once you tried to actually make the video file, the computer would start compiling. Of course, it would start all the way at the top, and it would start piecing all these all these single frames together into a video. When it made it to that bad frame, it would give you an error, but it wouldn't really tell you why. So just make absolutely sure that all of your frames are in fact real and that they are a whole picture. Sometimes it's just a matter of going back into Maya, going to that one frame, and of course we know exactly which frame is bad because it would say in the sequence which one was bad, and just re-rendering that one and then saving it with the right name so that it pops right here in the middle of the sequence. Then the computer would have no problem playing that. Okay? Now, if I wanted, just going to hit minus to zoom out a little bit, maybe I wanted to have a little piece of, maybe a title to put my name either at the beginning or the end. Now there's a couple of different ways you can do this. Of course you can just make a title screen in Photoshop and then just bring that in as a single image and then bring it into your timeline the same way that we just brought this animation in. Or if I right click inside of my empty space in my assets, I can go to New Item, and right here it says Title. Now when I click on Title, it's going to say, okay, well what do you want it to be called? So I'll call this Title Credit and hit OK. Now this window is going to pop open. And the first thing that I want you to notice is that we're looking as if I'm about to write my title on top of this animation. So I would say animation examples David Cooley. Okay. Now I don't like that font, so I'll change the font. Maybe we'll just do something like that. That's fine. And I'll center line it. So you guys should be pretty comfortable using these kinds of settings. You can also choose one of the presets if you wanted something to be, you know, just a little bit more bright and colorful, or if you had any particular thing, you know, you want to glow behind it. You're more than welcome to use any of these you want. But I want you to notice something really important. As soon as I'm done here and I'm happy with you know, the positioning and the location and everything else of this, and of course I'll put this in the upper thirds. When I close this out, where's my title? Why don't I see it here? Well, notice over here that it did make it. The only reason we were seeing this frame in that other window is because that's where I was on my timeline. And in fact, if I double click on the title card, if I wanted to edit any of this, once it raises it come back up, if I change the position, notice that it also changed position here. So if I go outside the animation, now I'm simply looking at it with a black background. Okay, so don't misunderstand what we're actually doing here. The only reason that it was showing me what the animation looked like is because that's where I was on the timeline. Okay, so if I wanted this credit to be at the beginning, I would simply select my animation and drag it further down the animation timeline. Then I could just bring this in and I could set it onto a top layer. Now, why would I want to set it to a top layer instead of the same layer? Well, that's where I can start creating transitions so that it doesn't just start with this already up and then suddenly pop over to this. I can actually come over to my effects layers, find video transitions, and underneath dissolve, I can say I want to have a cross dissolve. Now a cross dissolve is simply going to take whatever is in front or behind the video, in this case nothing, which means I'm going to have it fade up. See that? Now if I want it to fade down, I'll simply drag it over to the end, and you notice it highlights again, so that now it fades down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to line these two up and then come up from that one and then dissolve to the other one. So if I hit play, we'll see that this fades up, plays for the full 5 seconds that I want, and it fades away, and then the animation actually fades up. Now once the animation is all done, the animation would then fade away. Okay? Now, let's say, for example, that I had other pieces of animation that I wanted to include with this. I could add into my timelines, I could even do this. Watch. Instead of having it fade away before the other one fades up, I can actually, if I just zoom in a little bit, you can see this, I can drag it so that the two fades happen at the same time. That way, the video is fading up while the text is fading away. Okay? So you have some options in here, and they're very easy to work with. Also, if by default it says the dissolve is going to take 1 full second to happen, but I can actually grab it. Watch this. If I put my mouse at the very end of that transition, I can extend it, or I can actually shrink it, and it even tells me how much I'm changing it by. So that just means that the title credit comes up a little faster and then goes away. So let's say that I wanted my dissolve to dissolve away while the other one is still coming up. Now you notice that the text disappeared faster while this is still coming up. So you can time this out. You can set it and control it. But let's say, for example, that this is exactly what I wanted. I am so happy with this. Everything is exactly the way that I envisioned it, and I am ready to give it to my teacher or client. Because remember, handing in homework is basically you exercising, getting it done on time. So the first thing that I can do, notice that this border right here, this blue outline, is highlighting to let me know that I'm actually inside of this timeline. Okay, so I can hit Control M, or I can come over to my file and say Export Media, and you can see there it is, Control M. Now, when I hit Export Media, my export settings are going to pop up. Now, the first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that my format or my type of file I'm about to make is what I'm expecting. And remember, we've talked about making two different types, QuickTime as well as Windows Media video files. The reason that we want both of them is because QuickTime allows us to have a really good file that we can use for editing and putting demos together. But the Windows Media video file is great because it's a small file and it plays across a network very quickly. So that means that we can preview our work much faster. So we have format, and the first one we have is of course already set to QuickTime. If it's not, then it may already have been set to AVI or something else. But we want to choose QuickTime, and then inside of presets we can open this up. And what we're really looking for is an option that gives us this H.264. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the way that presets or codecs actually work, what we're really talking about is if a QuickTime is the book binding, the codec is actually the language that the book is written in. Now, different codecs require different installations. So for example, if you have a PC and you have QuickTime files that you'd like to play, but you've never installed QuickTime, there's no guarantee that you will actually be able to play them. You would have to go to the Apple website, you would have to download the QuickTime and install it onto your computer. Same thing with Windows Media video files. If you have a Macintosh, unless you have an external, also known as a third-party company's program, you won't be able to play Windows Media video files. So, H.264 is actually the codec, the type of compression that they use to make Blu-ray movies. So the video is very, very clean, it's very pretty, and what's really nice about it is if you already have QuickTime installed, chances are QuickTime is going to play it, and if you're on a PC, Windows Media Player will actually grab a hold of it and play it for you as well. So, notice right here it says HD 720. Now, if I choose 720, I can come over to my video files, my video options, and you see here it says the video codec, again, codec, but the H.264 codec says I want to make 720. Well, I'm going to change that number to 1080, and because this link is set, when I do that, notice how now we have 1920 by 1080. That's the original resolution of the video that I was rendering. Now, if you rendered something from Maya that was 720, you could use this preset and you'd be just fine. Now, quality, I always want to bring the quality up to 100. There's really no reason to let the computer actually pull some of the quality out of my pictures. And then, because we used a preset, notice we already have progressive images. They're not interlaced, which is great. And if I had any audio in it, I would have the audio all set up. Now, because this one doesn't have audio, I'm just going to turn off Export Audio. There's no reason to have it. So, in the output name, I'm simply going to choose where I want it to go, and depending on what you're actually, are you working on one of the computers at work or a school? If you're working on one of the school computers, you can always just drop it to the desktop temporarily. And then we just hit one of two buttons. Q means that it will actually get in line. That's what Q means. So if I hit Q, Media Encoder, a whole other program, is going to pop open, and I'll have options as far as making different videos and then setting them up. Or I can simply hit export, and then I'll have to wait for this particular video to be done. Okay, so what I could also do is I can hit this match source button, and it'll actually take on the 1920 by 1080 at 24 frames per second. It'll do all those things for me. Now what I do have to make sure of, though, is that down here we have codec, video codec set to H.264. Notice right here there is an awful lot of compressions that you can choose from, and some of them are better than others. Now, H.264 is really great because the file size isn't very big and the picture is very clean. For archiving, in other words, keeping like a really pristine, clean, finished version of your file, you might want to go with animation. But just keep in mind, animation is like a QuickTime file that has all of your TIFF files sitting inside of it. So it's an enormous file. But it's also really good for backing up your work if you wanted the cleanest, best version of your video. But H.264 does a really great job, and the files aren't too big. Okay? Now, I hit export, and as you can see, the computer is calculating. Now, depending again, speed of your computer, length of your project, complexity of what you're doing, this can be anything from a few seconds to a few minutes to a few hours. So just be extra careful and make sure that you've given yourself enough time to let the computer do what it needs to do. So once the file's all done, I can go check it. There's my file sitting on my desktop. And when it opens up, here's my animation, playing just like I had hoped. Okay, so I tested it out. I made sure that it was working. Now that I've tested it out, I'm happy to submit it to my teacher. Now, what I'm going to do is also, again, Control-M to get my export settings. By the way, Control-M is going to work fine for you. The program that I'm using to record this video uses its own Control-M hotkey, which is why it's taken away the ability for me to do this. But I'm going to come over to File, Export, Media, and then instead of QuickTime, I'm going to choose the Windows Media option. Now when it goes over to Windows Media, just be extra careful. It says right here, it can really throw you, audio only. Obviously we don't want audio only. What we're really looking for is HD video, 1080p, 24 frames per second. Now again, I can turn off the use audio, no problem. Don't just let it be saved as sequence 1. It's not going to help you at all. And then I'll hit export. So once again, the computer is going to go through its process. Windows Media video files actually get calculated twice. When it says pass 1 of 2, what it's actually doing right now is it's calculating, it's looking, it's analyzing the video and trying to find ways that it can be the most optimized. So it looks at it, it evaluates it, it sort of creates its own plan, and then it'll export the final version. Okay, so when this is all done, I will check it as well, make sure that everything is working the way that I want to, and as long as the whole thing is playing and I can hear it, if I had audio or whatever is working or not working, I'll make my changes, export it again if I have to, but I'll make sure that what I submit is really what I expect to show my teacher or my boss or my client or whoever else is supposed to be watching. All right, so I hope you had an eventful moment watching all of this. Okay, so I really hope that this helps you out in the future and hopefully takes away some of the problems you may have been having in the past. All right, so good luck and bye-bye.